The crack of a gunshot echoed through the still night, cutting through the muffled whispers of the city. A teenage boy collapsed onto the hard pavement of an abandoned construction site, his body trembling as the crimson stain on his hoodie grew. The police officer standing over him, his hands shaking, seemed frozen in time. Somewhere nearby, hidden in the shadows, a man in a black leather jacket watched the scene unfold with sharp, unblinking eyes. Keanu Reeves, an unlikely witness, stepped closer, his jaw tightening with each passing second. For a moment, there was only the sound of the officer's labored breathing. Then, as if the world snapped back into motion, Reeves pulled out his phone. He wasn't just watching anymore. 12 hours earlier, the sun beamed down on the quiet suburban neighborhood where 17-year-old Jamal Walker lived. His mom's voice carried through their small house as she called him for breakfast, her words tinged with affection and a hint of exasperation. "Jamal, you're going to be late for school again. I'm not writing another note." Jamal groaned, tossing aside the covers. He was a good kid. His teacher said so, and so did the basketball coach who wanted him on the team. But sometimes life felt like a balancing act. His mom worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, and Jamal helped out where he could, often taking care of his little sister, Layla. By the time he stumbled into the kitchen, Layla was already at the table, her backpack slung over her chair. "You're late, big bro," she teased. "I'm not late," Jamal said, ruffling her braids before sitting down. "I'm on Jamal time." Their mom placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him and sighed. "Jamal, time's going to get you in trouble one of these days." The day unfolded like any other. School dragged on, but Jamal didn't mind. He was looking forward to meeting up with his best friend, Malik, after class. They had plans to check out the old construction site on the edge of town, a spot rumored to have an amazing view of the city skyline. It wasn't exactly legal, but that didn't bother them. For Jamal, it was just another adventure. When the afternoon sun dipped low, Jamal and Malik met up at their usual spot, the corner store near the bus stop. Malik was already there, a mischievous grin on his face. "You ready for this?" Malik asked, holding up a flashlight. Jamal nodded. "Let's do it." The construction site was quiet when they arrived, the air thick with the smell of dust and metal. They hopped the chain-link fence with ease, landing on the other side like seasoned pros. The place was a maze of scaffolding and half-built walls, but Jamal and Malik navigated it like explorers. "Man, look at that," Malik said, pointing to the horizon as they reached the top of an unfinished building. The city lights sparkled like stars, stretching out as far as the eye could see. For a moment, Jamal felt invincible. Elsewhere in the city, Officer Greg Hayes sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee. It had been a quiet evening so far, the kind he preferred. He wasn't a bad cop, or at least he didn't think so. But years on the force had left him jaded, his instincts sharpened to a fine, sometimes dangerous edge. When the call came in about potential trespassers at the construction site, Hayes didn't hesitate. He flipped on the lights and hit the gas, the adrenaline kicking in as he sped toward the scene. Jamal and Malik were still marveling at the view when the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness below. "Who's there?" a voice barked, sharp and commanding. Jamal's heart sank. "Cops," he whispered. "We should run," Malik said, his voice shaky. But before they could move, the officer spotted them. Hayes shouted for them to stop, his hand already on his gun. Panic set in, and Malik bolted. Jamal hesitated for a split second too long, unsure whether to run or stay and try to explain. That hesitation cost him. Keanu Reeves had been walking his dog nearby when he heard the commotion. He wasn't one to seek out trouble, but something about the tension in the air made him linger. He followed the sound as curiosity piqued. What he saw next made his blood run cold. The officer fired a single shot, the crack of the gun louder than anything Keanu had ever heard. Jamal crumpled to the ground, a gasp escaping his lips as he clutched his chest. The flashlight fell from Hayes' hand, the beam illuminating the boy's face. Keanu stepped out of the shadows, his voice calm but firm. "What did you just do?" The officer whipped around, his eyes wide with panic. "Who are you?" he demanded. Keanu didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on Jamal, who lay motionless, his breath shallow. Without hesitation, Keanu pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his mind racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The silence after Keanu's words was heavy, suffocating. Officer Hayes stood frozen, his hand still gripping the gun like a lifeline. Jamal groaned weakly on the ground, the sound pulling Keanu's focus back to him. The boy was alive, but barely. Keanu's calm demeanor belied the storm brewing inside him. He locked eyes with Hayes, his voice steady. "You shot a kid. Call for an ambulance. Now." Hayes hesitated, sweat trickling down his temple. His training told him to take control of the situation, but this wasn't like the scenarios they'd drilled for. There was no script for being confronted by Keanu Reeves. What are you doing here?" Hayes stammered. Keanu stepped closer, his presence unnerving. "That's not the question you should be asking right now," he said, his tone colder. "The question is, how are you going to fix this?" A few minutes earlier, Malik had escaped the construction site, running faster than he ever had in his life. His chest heaved as he darted through the empty streets, his mind racing. He didn't stop until he reached a small park where he crouched behind a bench, his hands shaking. "Jamal," he whispered, guilt clawing at him. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen, debating whether to call anyone. But who would believe him? The cops? Not a chance. His mom? He'd be grounded for life. Then again, that was better than the alternative. Finally, he made a decision. He called Jamal's mom. Back at the site, Keanu crouched beside Jamal, pressing his hands gently against the boy's wound to slow the bleeding. Jamal's eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "Don't try to talk," Keanu said softly, his hand firm but reassuring. "Help is coming." Hayes fumbled with his radio, finally snapping out of his daze. "Officer down, no. Suspect down." He corrected himself, his voice shaky. "Send an ambulance to the construction site on West and Hawthorne." As he spoke, Hayes glanced nervously at Keanu. He didn't recognize him yet, but the man's presence was disconcerting. Why wasn't he panicking like most witnesses? Why did he seem prepared? Keanu looked up, his piercing gaze locking onto the officer. "You don't even know his name, do you?" Hayes flinched. He didn't. Meanwhile, Malik arrived at Jamal's house, his lungs burning from the sprint. He banged on the door, his urgency startling Mrs. Walker, who opened it with a worried expression. "Malik? What's wrong? Where's Jamal?" Malik stammered, struggling to find the words. "It's Jamal, he's hurt. At the construction site. A copy." Mrs. Walker didn't wait for him to finish. She grabbed her car keys and rushed to her car, Malik following close behind. The ride was tense, Malik filling in the details as best he could while Mrs. Walker gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. At the site, the wail of approaching sirens cut through the night. Hayes stepped back as the ambulance pulled up, two paramedics jumping out with a stretcher. Keanu helped guide them to Jamal, his calm demeanor never wavering. As the paramedics worked, Hayes tried to regain some semblance of control. "Sir, I need you to step back," he said to Keanu. Keanu rose slowly, towering over the officer. "You've already done enough damage," he said quietly. Before Hayes could respond, the paramedics lifted Jamal onto the stretcher. "We need to move now," one of them said. "This kid's in critical condition." Keanu followed them to the ambulance, his phone still in his hand. He had been recording everything since the moment he stepped out of the shadows. He wasn't just a witness, he was a storyteller, and this story needed to be told. The ambulance sped off, its lights flashing. Mrs. Walker's car arrived moments later, screeching to a halt. She jumped out, her eyes frantic as she scanned the scene. "Where's my son?" she demanded. Hayes stepped forward, unsure how to explain. "Ma'am, your son," Keanu interrupted, stepping between them. "Your son's on his way to the hospital," he said gently. "I'll take you there." Mrs. Walker hesitated, her gaze shifting between Keanu and the officer. Something about the man in black radiated a sense of safety, and she nodded, climbing back into her car. As Keanu and Mrs. Walker sped toward the hospital, Hayes stood alone at the scene, his mind a chaotic swirl of panic and denial. He didn't know who Keanu Reeves was, but something told him this man wasn't going to let this slide. At the hospital, the chaos continued. Jamal was rushed into surgery, while his mother paced the waiting room, her hands clasped in silent prayer. Keanu stayed by her side, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. Hours passed, the tension unbearable. Finally, a doctor emerged, his expression grave but hopeful. "He's stable," he said. "The bullet missed any major organs, but it was close. He's lucky to be alive." Mrs. Walker sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. "Thank God," she whispered. Keanu placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "This isn't over," he said. "The truth needs to come out." As he spoke, his phone buzzed with a notification. The video he had uploaded anonymously was already going viral. Keanu Reeves wasn't just a witness. He was now the catalyst for a reckoning. But as the night wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was only beginning. The morning light crept over the city, illuminating the cracks and shadows that yesterday had hidden. By now, Keanu's video had exploded online, drawing millions of views overnight. Headlines screamed with outrage. "Teen shot by police while trespassing." Video goes viral. Keanu Reeves exposes police brutality. And what happens when a superstar witnesses a shooting? In the hospital waiting room, Mrs. Walker sat clutching her phone, tears of relief mixing with dread. Malik was by her side, his face pale as he scrolled through comments on the video. "Mom," Malik said cautiously, "they're talking about Jamal everywhere. People are sharing his story." Mrs. Walker's hands trembled as she looked at the screen Malik held out. There was Jamal, bloodied and fragile, with Keanu's calm, determined voice narrating the horror. Her heart broke all over again, but there was something else, a small spark of hope. People cared. They were listening. Officer Hayes was anything but calm. Seated at a desk in his precinct, he stared at the computer screen, watching the video with a sinking feeling. His name wasn't in the news yet, but it was only a matter of time. His commanding officer, Captain Sullivan, stormed into the room, her face like thunder. "What the hell were you thinking, Hayes?" she demanded, slamming a folder onto the desk. "This video's a PR nightmare." Hayes stammered, his palms sweating. "I thought he had something. He didn't stop when I told him to." "You thought?" Sullivan cut him off, her voice razor sharp. "You shot an unarmed kid, and now the entire world knows it. Do you have any idea who's watching this? It's Keanu freaking Reeves." The weight of her words sank in. Hayes slumped in his chair, realizing just how deep a hole he'd dug himself into. Keanu sat across from Mrs. Walker in the hospital cafeteria, the lines on his face more pronounced under the fluorescent lights. He sipped his coffee in silence for a moment, then leaned forward. "We need to prepare," he said. "This isn't just about what happened to Jamal. It's about holding people accountable." Mrs. Walker nodded, her voice breaking. "I don't know where to start." "You've already started by being here," Keanu said gently. "But this fight isn't going to be easy. The system doesn't like being challenged." As they talked, a man in a crisp suit approached their table, his expression professional but wary. "Excuse me, Mrs. Walker," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Terrence Marshall, a civil rights attorney. I saw the video and wanted to offer my services. Your son deserves justice." Mrs. Walker hesitated, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Keanu gave her a reassuring nod. "He's on your side," he said. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the hospital, Malik sat alone, his mind racing. He hadn't told anyone yet, but he'd seen something at the construction site, something the video didn't capture. He remembered the way Hayes' hand had trembled on the gun, the look in his eyes that was more fear than malice. It didn't excuse what happened, but it complicated things. Should he speak up? Or would it make things worse? Malik's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. "I know what you saw. We need to talk." His heart skipped a beat. Who could possibly know? Outside the hospital, protesters were gathering, their signs and chants growing louder. The news crews weren't far behind, cameras rolling as the crowd swelled. Some were angry, others hopeful, but all of them were united by the video that had lit a fire under the city. Back inside, Keanu stood by the window, watching the scene unfold. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. Mrs. Walker joined him, her eyes red but determined. "What do we do next?" she asked. Keanu turned to her, his gaze steady. "We fight. For Jamal. And for everyone else this has happened to. That evening, as the city buzzed with tension, a new twist unfolded. Hayes sat alone in his apartment, drowning his fear in whiskey. He hadn't checked his phone all day, dreading the messages he knew were waiting for him. But when he finally mustered the courage, one notification caught his eye. It was an anonymous email. The subject line read, "We know what you did." The message was short but chilling. "You better come clean, or we will." His blood ran cold. Who were we? Was it Keanu? The protesters? Someone else entirely? In the hospital, Jamal's eyes flickered open for the first time since the shooting. Mrs. Walker rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face as she called for the nurse. Jamal's voice was weak, but his words were clear. "What happened?" Mrs. Walker held his hand tightly. "You're safe now, baby. That's all that matters." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't the whole truth. Jamal was alive, but their lives would never be the same. And somewhere out there, forces were moving, some for justice, others to cover their tracks. As the night deepened, the city braced for the storm that was coming. The storm hit the city by morning, not with rain or thunder, but with waves of outrage and relentless media coverage. News channels ran Keanu's video on repeat, spliced with interviews from activists, legal experts, and eyewitnesses. Protesters had grown into the thousands, their chants echoing through the streets. Justice for Jamal. Inside the hospital, Jamal stirred in his bed, his body weak, but his mind racing. His mother sat at his side, her hand clasping his. Malik stood in the corner, nervous and unsure how to face his friend after running away that night. Jamal's voice, though faint, broke the silence. "Mom, what's going on?" Mrs. Walker hesitated. "You were hurt, baby, but you're safe now." Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly, searching her face. "What about Malik?" He was there too. Malik stepped forward, guilt written all over his face. "I'm here, man. I'm sorry I ran." Jamal gave a faint nod, his expression unreadable. "It's okay. I'd probably run too." But the weight of what had happened wasn't lost on him. He could see it in their eyes. Something bigger was happening outside these walls. At the precinct, Officer Hayes sat in an interrogation room, not as a suspect, but as someone under intense scrutiny. Captain Sullivan leaned against the wall, her arms crossed. "Greg," she said, her tone cold, "this department is in the spotlight, and you've put us there. I need the truth. What exactly happened that night?" Hayes rubbed his face, the stubble on his chin prickling his palm. "It was dark. They were running. I told them to stop. And then you shot an unarmed kid," Sullivan snapped. "You think that's going to hold up in court? The video shows you didn't even try to de-escalate." Hayes flinched. "I thought he had a weapon." Stop," Sullivan interrupted. "This isn't just about you. This is about the department, the city, and every other cop on the force. If you've got skeletons, now's the time to air them. Because if you lie to me, I'll hang you out to dry." Hayes swallowed hard, knowing he was trapped. He couldn't admit the full truth, not yet. Not while he was still figuring out how to survive this. At the hospital, Keanu met with Terrence Marshall in the cafeteria. Their conversation quiet but charged. "We got traction," Terrence said. "The video's evidence, but we need more. Statements, police records, anything that shows a pattern of misconduct." Keanu nodded. "I've already contacted some people I trust, journalists, advocates. They're digging into Hayes' history." "What about the Walkers?" Terrence asked. "They're the ones who'll need to push this forward." "They're ready," Keanu said, though he knew Mrs. Walker was still coming to terms with everything. But this is going to get uglier before it gets better. In a dimly lit room, far from the protests and the hospital, a small group of people huddled around a laptop. The screen displayed a pause frame from the viral video, Hayes' face illuminated in the flashlight's glare. "We need to expose him," one man said, his voice low but firm. "The department's protecting him. If we don't act, they'll bury this." Another person, a woman with sharp eyes, nodded. "We need more than the video." "What about Malik? He saw everything." "He's just a kid," the first man replied. "He won't talk. Then we find someone who will." Malik couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him since he'd received the anonymous message. He hadn't told anyone yet, not even Jamal. But the words kept replaying in his mind. I know what you saw. We need to talk. That evening, as he left the hospital for some air, his phone buzzed again. Another message from the same number. Meet me at the park, 10 p.m. You know which one. Malik's hands trembled as he stared at the screen. Was it a trap? A setup by the cops? Or someone trying to help? Against his better judgment, he decided to go. He owed it to Jamal to figure out the truth. At the park, the air was cool and heavy with tension. Malik arrived a few minutes early, his heart pounding. He scanned the area, looking for the sender of the messages. Malik, a voice called from the shadows. A tall figure stepped into the light of a nearby lamppost. It was a man in his late 20s, his face partially obscured by a hoodie. Who are you? Malik asked, his voice shaky. Someone who wants justice, the man said. I know what happened to the construction site. I know what you saw. How do you know? Malik asked, his eyes narrowing. I've been tracking Hayes for months, the man replied. You're not the first kid he's hurt. But this time, we got a chance to stop him. For good. Malik hesitated, torn between fear and a growing sense of responsibility. What do you want me to do? The man smiled faintly. Tell the truth, no matter how hard it gets. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Keanu received a troubling call. The voice on the other end was low and urgent. Reeves, this is bigger than you think. Hayes isn't just a bad cop, he's protected. There's a network covering for him, and they're already working to discredit you and the walkers. Keanu's jaw tightened. Who are you? Let's just say I'm someone who's seen this before, the voice said. Watch your back. They'll come for you next. As the line went dead, Keanu sat in silence, the weight of the warning settling on his shoulders. He wasn't afraid for himself, but for Jamal, Mrs. Walker, and the truth they were fighting to uncover. At that exact moment, a commotion broke out in the hospital. A man in plain clothes pushed past the front desk, demanding to see Jamal. Security intervened, but not before the man shouted something that sent chills through the air. You think you can ruin a cop's life and get away with it? You're dead wrong. As the guards wrestled him out of the building, Keanu arrived on the scene, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't just about one cop anymore. It was about a system fighting to protect itself, and it was willing to play dirty. The tension rose with every passing hour. Malik's meeting, the warning call, the hospital outburst. All were threads in a tangled web that seemed to grow larger and more dangerous by the minute. And as the city braced for another night of protests, Keanu realized they weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting for survival. The hospital quieted after the outburst, but the tension lingered like a shadow. Security guards now flanked the entrance to Jamal's room, their presence a stark reminder of the danger surrounding the walkers. Mrs. Walker sat at her son's bedside, holding his hand tightly, as if letting go might mean losing him again. Jamal's voice broke the silence. Mom, what's going on? Why are there guards outside? Mrs. Walker hesitated, not wanting to burden him with the full truth. But before she could answer, the door opened, and Keanu stepped in. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen too much. Jamal, Keanu said, his voice steady, we need to talk. Earlier that night, Malik returned home from his meeting at the park. His thoughts raced, replaying the man's words, tell the truth. No matter how hard it gets. It sounded simple, but Malik knew it wouldn't be. As he climbed the steps to his house, his phone buzzed again. It was another message from the same number. You did good, kid. Now it's time to act. Malik stared at the screen, a knot forming in his stomach. What did they mean by act? And why did it feel like he was being drawn into something much bigger than himself? At the precinct, Officer Hayes sat at his desk, staring blankly at the computer monitor. He had barely slept since the shooting, the weight of the situation crushing him. The anonymous email he had received earlier still haunted him. We know what you did. You better come clean, or we will. Hayes, Captain Sullivan barked, snapping him out of his daze. You've got an IA hearing tomorrow. You better have your story straight. Hayes nodded numbly. He knew what that meant. Stick to the script. Claim he feared for his life. Justify the shooting. But as the pressure mounted, he couldn't shake the memory of Jamal's face, the moment he realized the kid was unarmed. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was a new email. The subject line read, "TikTok." The message contained a single line. "The truth always comes out." At the hospital, Keanu sat beside Jamal's bed, his tone serious but gentle. "Jamal, what happened to you wasn't just an accident. It was wrong, and people are fighting for you out there. But we need your help." Jamal's brow furrowed. "Help? How? I don't even remember much." "You don't have to remember everything," Keanu said. "Just tell the truth. What were you doing that night? What did the officer say to you?" Jamal hesitated, the memory foggy but laced with fear. "We were just hanging out looking at the view. Then he showed up and started yelling. I didn't even move. I was too scared. And then he trailed off, his hand moving instinctively to his bandaged chest. He shot me." Mrs. Walker's face crumpled, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Keanu placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "We'll make sure everyone hears your story." Outside the hospital, the protests grew louder and more intense. Demonstrators held signs reading "Justice for Jamal" and "End Police Brutality," their voices echoing through the streets. News crews captured the scene, broadcasting it to millions across the country. But not everyone in the crowd was there for justice. Hidden among the protesters were plainclothes officers and agitators, their goal to disrupt and discredit the movement. One man, dressed like an ordinary protester, slipped through the crowd with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His target? The hospital. Malik couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, his thoughts a chaotic mess. Finally, he grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Dad," he said when the line connected, his voice trembling. "I need your help." His father, a stern but fair man who had always tried to steer Malik in the right direction, listened quietly. "What's going on, son?" Malik took a deep breath. "It's about Jamal. The cop who shot him. There's more to it. And I think I might know something that could help." Inside the hospital, Keanu stepped out of Jamal's room for a moment to take a call. It was from one of his journalist contacts. "Reeves," the voice said urgently, "we've uncovered something big. Hayes has a history, complaints of excessive force, racial profiling. But it's been buried by the department. This isn't his first incident." Keanu's jaw tightened. "Send me everything you have." "Already did," the journalist replied. "Be careful. If they buried this, they won't want it coming out." Keanu hung up and opened his email, scanning the documents. The evidence was damning. Hayes wasn't just a bad cop. He was a pattern of abuse the system had allowed to continue. The man with the duffel bag reached the hospital's back entrance, slipping past the security guards unnoticed. Inside the bag was a crude explosive device, its timer already ticking. His orders were clear: create chaos, shift the narrative, and make the protesters look like the enemy. As he moved through the corridors, the countdown ticked closer to 0. Keanu returned to Jamal's room, his face grim. "We've got evidence," he told Mrs. Walker. "Enough to prove Hayes shouldn't have even been on the force. But we have to move fast." Suddenly, the building shook with a deafening explosion. The lights flickered and the hospital's alarms blared. Keanu rushed to the window, his heart sinking as smoke billowed from the lower floors. Security burst into the room. "We need to evacuate now," one of them shouted. Mrs. Walker grabbed Jamal's hand, her face pale. "What's happening?" Keanu's mind raced. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone wanted to derail their fight for justice. And they had just raised the stakes. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air as chaos erupted throughout the hospital. Patients, staff, and visitors scrambled to evacuate, their shouts and cries blending with the wail of alarms. Keanu gripped Mrs. Walker's arm, steadying her as she tried to help Jamal. "We need to get out of here now," Keanu said firmly, his eyes darting toward the door. "Stay close." Jamal winced as Keanu and Mrs. Walker helped him out of the bed and into a wheelchair. His injuries made every movement painful, but he didn't complain. The urgency in Keanu's voice told him this was no time to hesitate. Downstairs, security guards and firefighters worked to contain the fire spreading through the lower floors. The explosion had torn apart the hospital's main electrical system, plunging parts of the building into darkness. Amid the chaos, The man with the duffel bag slipped away unnoticed, blending into the panicked crowd outside. Keanu led the way down a smoke-filled corridor, guiding the walkers toward the emergency exit. The wheelchair rattled over the uneven floor as Mrs. Walker pushed it with trembling hands. Jamal clutched the armrests, his breathing labored. Almost there, Keanu assured them, though his own heart raced. The building creaked ominously, and the faint sound of sirens in the distance was their only promise of help. Suddenly, a security guard appeared at the end of the hallway, shouting, "This area is not safe. Take the south exit. It's clearer." Keanu nodded and pivoted toward the new route. But as they turned a corner, they were met with a different kind of threat. In the shadows, two men in plain clothes blocked their path. Their demeanor wasn't that of hospital staff or first responders. They were something else. One of them stepped forward, his eyes cold. "Keanu Reeves," he said, his tone laced with menace. "You've been making things very difficult." Keanu's gaze hardened. He positioned himself protectively in front of the walkers. "And who are you supposed to be?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Doesn't matter," the man replied. "You're coming with us. Leave the family. They're not our problem." Mrs. Walker clutched Jamal's shoulder, her fear palpable. "What do you want with him?" she demanded. The second man pulled a small device from his pocket, revealing a live feed of Keanu's video. "You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong," he said. "Time to step aside." Keanu took a deliberate step forward. "If you want me, you'll have to go through all of us." The men exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. One of them reached for something beneath his jacket. Before they could act, the sound of pounding footsteps echoed down the hall. Malik appeared, breathless and wide-eyed. He had heard the explosion from his home and rushed to the hospital, determined to find Jamal. "Hey!" Malik shouted, his voice breaking the tense silence. "What's going on here?" The distraction was all Keanu needed. With surprising speed, he lunged at the nearest man, disarming him with a swift motion. The other man backed away, clearly reconsidering his options. "Malik, help Mrs. Walker and Jamal," Keanu ordered, holding the weapon he'd taken. "Get them out of here." Malik nodded, grabbing the wheelchair and pushing it toward the exit. Mrs. Walker followed, her heart pounding as she glanced back at Keanu. "Come with us," she pleaded. "I'll be right behind you," Keanu promised, his focus never wavering from the two men. "Go!" The walkers and Malik made it to the emergency exit, where firefighters and paramedics were already assisting evacuees. Jamal was immediately whisked away to an ambulance, Mrs. Walker clinging to his side. Malik, still shaken, tried to catch his breath. "What about Keanu?" Malik asked, his voice trembling. Mrs. Walker shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "He said he'd come. We have to trust him." Inside the hospital, Keanu faced the men, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the chaos around them. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will," he said, his voice steady. The men exchanged a look, then retreated without another word. They weren't prepared for this fight. Not here, not now. Keanu watched them disappear into the smoke, then turned and sprinted toward the exit. The building groaned ominously, and debris fell from the ceiling as he ran. He barely made it out before the structure gave a final, bone-shaking tremor. Outside, the crowd cheered as Keanu emerged from the smoke, coughing but unscathed. Mrs. Walker ran to him, relief flooding her face. "You're okay," she said, her voice breaking. Keanu nodded, his expression resolute. "I'm fine, but this fight is far from over." As firefighters worked to extinguish the blaze, investigators began piecing together the cause of the explosion. It didn't take long for them to identify the remnants of the device left behind, a crude bomb designed to sow chaos. Meanwhile, news of the hospital attack spread rapidly, adding fuel to an already volatile situation. Protesters demanded answers, and the media speculated about who was behind the bombing. Later that night, Keanu sat with Mrs. Walker and Malik in a safe house arranged by Terrence Marshall. Jamal was stable but still recovering, and the hospital staff had agreed to keep his new location confidential. "They tried to silence us," Keanu said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "But all they did was prove how far they're willing to go to protect themselves." Mrs. Walker nodded, her fear replaced by resolve. "We won't stop," she said. "Not until Jamal gets justice." Malik hesitated, then spoke up. "I have something to say." "That cop, Hayes, I saw the way he acted. He didn't just panic. He was afraid, like he knew what he was doing was wrong." Keanu's eyes narrowed. "Afraid of what?" Malik swallowed hard. "I think he's hiding something. Something big." Outside, the city simmered with unrest, the tension reaching a boiling point. And as the clock ticked toward another dawn, one thing was clear. This was no longer just a fight for Jamal. It was a battle against an entire system, and the stakes had never been higher. The safe house was quiet, but the tension inside was palpable. Mrs. Walker sat by the window, gazing out at the dark street. Jamal rested in a bed in the next room, his labored breathing a constant reminder of how close they had come to losing him. Keanu leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face grim. Malik fidgeted nervously in the corner. His mind was a whirlwind, replaying the night at the construction site and the cryptic meeting at the park. He glanced at Keanu, who seemed to sense his unease. "Malik," Keanu said, breaking the silence, "if there's something you know, anything, it's time to tell us." Malik hesitated, his hands trembling. "That cop Hayes, when he showed up, it wasn't like he was just doing his job. He looked nervous, like he wasn't supposed to be there." Mrs. Walker turned from the window, her brow furrowed. "Nervous? Why would he be nervous?" "I don't know," Malik admitted. "But there's something else. After the shooting, he said something. I thought he had it. I don't know what it is, but it sounded off." Keanu's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. He wasn't just there to chase off trespassers. He was looking for something, or someone. Across the city, Officer Hayes sat in his darkened apartment, his head in his hands. The bottle of whiskey on the table was nearly empty, and the email on his laptop screen seemed to taunt him. "We know what you did." Hayes knew he couldn't keep running from the truth. The shooting wasn't just a mistake. It was part of a larger secret he had been trying to bury for years. But now the walls were closing in. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. The number was blocked, but he answered anyway. "Hello," Hayes said, his voice hoarse. "You're losing control," a voice on the other end said, cold and detached. "You need to fix this, or we'll fix it for you." Hayes' stomach churned. "What do you want me to do?" "Disappear. Lay low. And make sure no one finds out what you were doing that night." The call ended abruptly, leaving Hayes in a deeper pit of despair. He knew what they meant. If the truth came out, it wouldn't just be his career, it would be his life. At the safe house, Terrence Marshall arrived with new information. He placed a folder on the table and opened it, revealing pages of documents and photographs. "This is Hayes' personnel file," Terrence said. "It wasn't easy to get, but it confirms what we suspected. He's had multiple complaints of excessive force and racial profiling. But here's the kicker. He's been part of a task force investigating gang activity in the area." Keanu leaned forward, studying the documents. "What kind of gang activity?" Terrence pointed to a map marked with red dots. "Drugs, weapons, trafficking. The construction site where Jamal was shot? It's tied to an operation they were running. Hayes wasn't there by accident." Mrs. Walker's voice trembled with anger. "So, my son got caught in the middle of their mess?" Terrence nodded solemnly. "It looks that way, but we need more evidence to prove it." Keanu straightened, his expression resolute. "Then we find it. Whatever they're hiding, we expose it." The next morning, Keanu and Terrence devised a plan. They would dig deeper into the connections between Hayes and the task force, starting with the construction site. Malik offered to help, despite Mrs. Walker's protests. "I was there," Malik said. "I might remember something that helps." Mrs. Walker sighed, her protective instincts warring with her desire for justice. Finally, she relented. "Be careful," she said. "All of you." That night, Keanu and Malik returned to the construction site, armed with flashlights and a growing sense of determination. The site was eerily quiet, the half-built structures casting long shadows in the moonlight. "This place gives me the creeps," Malik admitted, his voice low. "Stay close," Keanu said, scanning the area. "We're looking for anything out of place. Something Hayes might have been after." As they moved deeper into the site, Malik froze. "Wait," he said, pointing to a stack of crates near the edge of the lot. "Those weren't here before." Keanu approached the crates cautiously, prying one open with a crowbar. Inside were dozens of small packages wrapped in plastic. Drugs, Keanu muttered, his jaw tightening. This is what they were protecting? Malik stepped back, his heart racing. You think Hayes was part of this? Not just part of it, Keanu said. He was covering it up, and Jamal got in the way. As they left the site, Keanu noticed a car parked nearby, its headlights off. He stopped, signaling for Malik to stay quiet. Someone's watching us, Keanu whispered. Before they could retreat, the car's engine roared to life, and it sped toward them. Keanu grabbed Malik, pulling him out of the way just in time. The car screeched to a halt, and two men jumped out, their faces obscured by masks. You shouldn't have come back here, one of them growled. Keanu squared his shoulders, stepping protectively in front of Malik. Too late for that. The men lunged, but Keanu was ready. He moved with precision, disarming one of them with a swift motion. Malik scrambled to find cover as the second man swung a crowbar. Keanu dodged, countering with a blow that sent the man sprawling. As the attackers retreated, Keanu grabbed one of their dropped phones, a burner device with only a single message on the screen: secure the site. No witnesses. Back at the safe house, Keanu placed the phone on the table, his expression grim. They're not just covering up corruption, he said. They're willing to kill to keep it quiet. Mrs. Walker's hands trembled as she clutched her son's photo. What do we do now? Keanu's voice was steady. We keep fighting, and we don't stop until the truth is out. But deep down, he knew the stakes had just escalated. They weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting for their lives. The safe house had never felt more oppressive. Mrs. Walker sat beside Jamal's bed, holding his hand tightly, as if her grip could shield him from the danger looming outside. Malik paced the room, his nerves frayed after the confrontation at the construction site. Keanu leaned against the wall, his face a mask of calm, though his eyes betrayed the storm within. Terrence Marshall sat at the table, reviewing the evidence Keanu and Malik had gathered. The crates of drugs, the burner phone, and the connection to Officer Hayes painted a clear picture of corruption. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. This is a start, Terrence said, his tone measured. But we need a direct link. Something that proves Hayes and his task force were running this operation. Keanu's jaw tightened. Then we'll find it. Mrs. Walker looked up, her voice trembling. How much more do we have to risk? My son is still healing, and they've already tried to kill us. Terrence met her gaze, his expression sympathetic. I understand, but if we don't see this through, they'll bury the truth. They'll make it look like Jamal was just another statistic. Jamal stirred in his bed, his voice faint but firm. We can't let them win, Mom. Mrs. Walker's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her resolve hardening. What's the plan? The plan began with a risky move. Keanu and Terrence would dig deeper into Hayes' past, focusing on his financial records and connections within the department. Meanwhile, Malik, despite his fears, agreed to meet with the man from the park again, hoping to learn more about the network protecting Hayes. That evening, Malik sat nervously on a park bench, his hands stuffed in his pockets. The man appeared out of the shadows, his hoodie pulled low. You came back, the man said, his voice calm. Malik swallowed hard. You said you wanted the truth. I'm here to help. The man nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. Hayes isn't just a bad cop. He's part of a network that's been running drugs and weapons through this city for years. The task force was their cover. But they've gotten sloppy. What do you mean? Malik asked. They got greedy, the man replied. Hayes and his team started cutting corners, making enemies. That's why they were at the construction site. They thought someone was trying to steal their product. Malik's stomach churned. So they thought Jamal was involved? They didn't care who got in their way, the man said. But if you want to bring them down, you need proof. I can help with that. At the same time, Keanu and Terrence were deep into their investigation. Using contacts in journalism and law, they uncovered records of suspicious bank transfers linked to Hayes and several other officers on the task force. Large sums of money had been funneled through shell companies, all tied to the construction site and other known drug hubs. This is it, Terrence said, pointing to the documents. This connects them to the operation. But we need to get this to the right people before they can destroy it. Keanu nodded. I'll handle the press. You focus on the legal side. As they worked, Keanu's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. They know what you're doing. Watch your back. Later that night, the safe house became a fortress. Security was tightened, and everyone was on edge. Keanu stayed up late, reviewing the evidence again and again, determined to anticipate their next move. But just as he was about to call it a night, he heard the sound of tires screeching outside. He looked out the window and saw two black SUVs pulling up, their headlights cutting through the darkness. "They're here," Keanu said, his voice calm but urgent. "Everyone, stay inside." The attackers moved quickly, breaking through the perimeter with frightening precision. Keanu stepped into the shadows, using the element of surprise to take down the first man who breached the door. Malik and Mrs. Walker hid with Jamal, their hearts pounding as the chaos unfolded. One of the attackers entered the room where they were hiding, but before he could act, Keanu appeared behind him, taking him out silently. "We need to move," Keanu whispered, helping them to their feet. "They won't stop until they find us." Outside, the remaining attackers regrouped, their frustration mounting. But before they could plan their next move, sirens wailed in the distance. Someone, likely Terrence, had called the police. The attackers scattered, disappearing into the night as the flashing lights approached. Keanu ushered everyone into a waiting car, his mind already racing with their next steps. By the time the sun rose, they were safe again, but the close call had left them shaken. Terrence arrived at their new location with good news. The evidence had been delivered to a trusted journalist, and the story was already gaining traction. "This is going to blow up," Terrence said. "They can't cover it up now." Keanu nodded, but his focus was on Mrs. Walker and Jamal. "Are you okay?" he asked. Mrs. Walker gave a weak smile. "We're okay, thanks to you." But even as they took a moment to breathe, they all knew the fight wasn't over. The truth was out there now, but so were the people who wanted to silence it. And as the city braced for what was to come, one thing was clear. The battle for justice had reached its breaking point. The news broke like a thunderclap, shaking the city to its core. Headlines screamed, "Corrupt task force exposed." New evidence ties police to drug operation. Keanu Reeves helps uncover massive cover-up, and justice for Jamal gains momentum. Social media exploded with outrage and support, while the protests swelled to unprecedented numbers. The truth was out, but the danger wasn't over. At their new safe house, Keanu, Mrs. Walker, Jamal, Malik, and Terrence huddled around a television, watching the coverage unfold. A trusted journalist, the same one Keanu had worked with to release the evidence, was presenting the damning details. The financial records, the drugs at the construction site, and the burner phone. The documents reveal a pattern of corruption spanning years, the journalist said. And while Officer Greg Hayes has not yet been charged, sources confirm he is under investigation. Jamal's voice was quiet but firm. "They can't ignore this now." Keanu nodded, his expression serious. "No, they can't. But they'll fight back. They always do." At the precinct, chaos reigned. Captain Sullivan slammed her fist on her desk as officers scrambled to deal with the fallout. Hayes sat in the interrogation room, pale and trembling. He had been ordered to stay put until internal affairs arrived, but the walls felt like they were closing in. "You have no idea how deep this goes," Hayes muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. "They'll throw me under the bus to save themselves." The door opened, and a man in a sharp suit walked in, his expression cold and calculating. Hayes recognized him immediately, one of the higher-ups who had overseen the task force. "Greg," the man said, his tone flat, "you've made a mess." Hayes's hands trembled. "I didn't have a choice. They were going to find out." The man's gaze hardened. "And now they have. You've put us all at risk. What do you want me to do?" Hayes asked, his voice desperate. The man leaned closer, his voice a whisper. "Take the fall. Say it was your operation, and you went rogue. If you don't, we'll make sure you never get the chance to speak." Back at the safe house, Malik paced the room, his mind racing. If Hayes is under investigation, that means he's the weak link, right? He knows everything. Keanu nodded. "Exactly. If we can get to him before they do, he might be willing to talk." Terrence frowned. "That's a big if. He's probably under tight security." Keanu's eyes narrowed. Not if they're planning to silence him. Mrs. Walker shuddered. You think they'd kill him to protect themselves? They've already shown what they're capable of, Keanu said grimly. We can't wait. We need to act now. That night, Keanu and Terrence put their plan into motion. Using contacts within the media and law enforcement, they tracked Hayes to a secure location, a safe house arranged by the department to protect him during the investigation. But it wasn't just officers watching over him. There were whispers of plainclothes operatives working for the corrupt network. Keanu's plan was bold. Confront Hayes directly and offer him a way out. Under the cover of darkness, Keanu and Terrence approached the safe house. Malik insisted on coming, despite Keanu's initial objections. I was there when it started, Malik said. I want to see it through. Keanu finally relented, though he made Malik promise to stay back unless it was absolutely necessary. Inside the safe house, Hayes sat alone, his paranoia growing by the minute. He flinched at every sound, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When the knock on the door came, he nearly jumped out of his chair. Who is it? Hayes called, his voice shaking. It's Reeves, came the calm reply. We need to talk. Hayes hesitated, then opened the door a crack. When he saw Keanu standing there, flanked by Terrence and Malik, he froze. What are you doing here? Hayes demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu pushed the door open, his gaze steady. We're here to give you a choice. Tell the truth, or let them bury you. Hayes laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair. You think they'll let me live if I talk? They won't, Keanu said bluntly. But if you don't, they'll make you the scapegoat. You'll take the fall for everything. Terrence stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. We can protect you, Hayes. If you come clean, we'll make sure the truth comes out. Hayes hesitated, his eyes darting to the window. You don't get it. They're everywhere. They'll find me no matter what. Keanu leaned in, his voice low and intense. You're right. They're dangerous. But the only way to beat them is to expose them. You know their names, their operations. You can end this. Outside, headlights appeared in the distance, moving toward the safe house. Malik, watching from a window, whispered urgently, We got company. Keanu turned to Hayes. This is your last chance. Come with us, or stay here and take your chances. Hayes looked at the approaching vehicles, the panic in his eyes giving way to grim resolve. Fine, he said. I'll talk. But if this goes south, it's on you. Keanu nodded. Let's move. The group slipped out the back just as the SUVs arrived. They moved quickly through the shadows, Keanu guiding them toward an escape vehicle Terrence had arranged. Malik glanced nervously over his shoulder, the tension mounting with every step. As they reached the car, the sound of shouting and gunfire erupted behind them. Hayes flinched, his fear palpable, but Keanu pushed him forward. Get in, Keanu barked. The car sped away, leaving the chaos behind. Inside, Hayes stared at Keanu, his expression a mix of fear and determination. What now? Hayes asked. Now, Keanu said, his voice steady. You tell us everything. The car sped through the city streets, headlights cutting through the darkness as Keanu, Terrence, Malik, and Hayes worked against the clock. Every turn brought them closer to safety, but also closer to the moment of reckoning. Hayes sat in the back seat, his face pale and drenched in sweat. The weight of his decision to cooperate bore down on him, but there was no turning back now. He glanced at Keanu in the driver's seat, his voice trembling. You don't understand what you've gotten yourselves into. These people aren't just cops. They have power, money, connections. Keanu's gaze stayed focused on the road. They've used that power to hurt too many people. It ends tonight. They arrived at a secure location arranged by Terrence, a small, nondescript building where trusted journalists and federal investigators waited. The group hurried inside, the tension palpable. A team of agents greeted them, taking Hayes into custody for his protection. You'll be safe here, one of the agents assured him. But you need to start talking now. For the next several hours, Hayes laid everything out. He named names, described operations, and detailed the flow of money and drugs that had corrupted the city for years. He confirmed that the construction site where Jamal was shot had been a key location for smuggling operations, and that his superiors had ordered him to secure it at any cost. "I didn't know the kid would be there," Hayes said, his voice breaking. "I panicked. I thought he had a gun, but they didn't care about him. They only cared about what he might have seen." Keanu leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "What about the network protecting you? How deep does this go?" Hayes swallowed hard. "All the way to the top." The evidence Hayes provided, combined with the documents and video already released, created a firestorm. By dawn, the city was in an uproar. News outlets broadcast the shocking revelations, and arrests began sweeping through the police department. High-ranking officials, once thought untouchable, were taken into custody. The protests outside the precinct reached a fever pitch as demonstrators demanded accountability. Chants of "justice for Jamal" filled the air, joined by calls for broader reform. At the hospital, Jamal watched the news from his bed, his mother by his side. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe. Jamal turned to her, a faint smile on his lips. "They did it," he said. "We did it." Mrs. Walker kissed his forehead, tears streaming down her face. "You're so brave, baby. They're finally listening." Keanu stood outside the courthouse, watching as reporters swarmed around the latest developments. Terrence approached, a satisfied look on his face. "It's over," Terrence said. "The task force is dismantled, and the city's launching a full investigation into the department." Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a start, but the fight isn't over. Jamal's not the only one this has happened to. We need to keep the pressure on." Terrence smiled. "You're right. And with people like you and the Walkers, I think we can." Later that evening, Keanu visited the Walkers at the hospital. Jamal greeted him with a weak but genuine smile. "Thanks for everything," Jamal said. "You didn't have to do any of this." Keanu crouched beside him, his tone gentle. "I couldn't just stand by. What happened to you is wrong. And people like Hayes and the others, people who abuse their power, they count on silence. You're the reason they couldn't get away with it this time." Mrs. Walker clasped Keanu's hand. "We'll never forget what you've done for us." "For Jamal." Keanu shook his head. "You're the heroes. I just helped tell your story." As the city began to heal, change rippled through its streets. New leadership in the police department vowed to restore trust, and community leaders worked tirelessly to ensure accountability. Jamal became a symbol of resilience and hope, his story inspiring others to speak out and demand justice. Keanu returned to his quiet life, but the experience stayed with him. He knew the fight for justice wasn't over, but for now, he found solace in knowing that one family's story had sparked a movement. Months later, as Jamal walked out of the hospital on his own 2 feet, flanked by his mother and Malik, the crowd outside erupted in cheers. Keanu stood at the edge of the gathering, a faint smile on his face as he watched Jamal embrace the support of the community. This wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. For Jamal, for his family, and for a city that had been forced to confront its darkest truths.